You know, that's the thing. You know, I read that thing, and you have to hear the context here. I'm a college professor, okay, and this is the end of the semester, and I am getting term papers from students, and I have to grade them and read them. No student in my entire history has ever tried to turn in a 50-page term paper that's built on 2 sentences from one book. You know, I just read that thing with growing disbelief, because that's really all he's got. Is he's got a few vague references to Galen and Aristotle. He's got a very poorly understood references to embryology, but the heart of his paper is simply 2 sentences where we go from what was it, mingled fluids to clinging thing to chewed flesh, and that is non-specific. It's very broad. It's basically got no relationship at all to what we know about human embryology. These are the very general poetic statements of somebody who's writing this great big book to gather his followers, but doesn't really know much about biology and doesn't really care. For sources then to inflate it into this grand story that's comparable in any way to what we do in developmental biology that's pure hubris. It's just silliness. When he confronted me in Ireland, he and Adnan Hashid came up to me, and they were haranguing me that it was impossible for Muhammad to know any of this stuff, that it was a miracle, divine miracle, that the Quran contained this much scientific information. And he also talked about things like mountains having roots and silly stuff like this. And now he's really backed off. When you read that paper, that's not what it says at all. It says, it's compatible with science. It's pointing the way for the followers of Allah to pursue the natural world, that kind of thing. So yeah, you're right. He has made a major concession here.
They've gone on record now accusing you, Professor, as having changed or reversed your position because they changed their argument and then you changed your counter argument.
And I haven't changed my counter. I made basically they're nitpicking over 2 statements. One is, I first said in Ireland that if they were claiming that the Quran said there was a strict sequence going from bones to bones covered with muscle, then it was wrong. Okay? And what I've now said is that in addition, when you actually look at those verses of the Quran, what they're really saying is something so vague and nebulous about developmental biology that they can twist it any way they want. As was mentioned earlier here, you know, if it were some other order, they could fit that. They could fit the Quranic verses to that. If it were, you know, simultaneous, they'd fit the Quranic verses to it. So what it's really saying is that early initial interpretation they gave me was wrong, but the verse is so amorphous that it's not even wrong. It's empty of content. In science, we really value clearly stated, testable hypotheses. If you're going to say anything, you know, you've got to say something where you have something everyone else can get a handle on. So we can go out and test it, evaluate your conclusions, look at it. And when somebody makes a nebulous hypothesis like this, we reject it, you know, unambiguously. It's gone. It's not worth paying any attention to. It's an old joke in science that when something is that bad, we say it's not even wrong because it's not possible to evaluate the statement. It is poorly framed. It's a bad piece of science. You know, they ought to just be honest and say, okay, the book is not a science textbook. It's written by people who had a very limited knowledge of the physical world, and it's reflecting their ignorance and knowledge, both of those. And so the whole business about the embryology of developing humans, they knew next to nothing about this. They had a little bit from Galen, a little bit from Aristotle, but even those 2 guys didn't have everything right. They were pretty vague in a lot of things. And that's all they've got. There's no divinity involved. There's no infallibility involved. It's just written by a bunch of people doing their best to understand the world. And in this case, doing their best to understand the world while not really caring all that much about biology.
I think that the interesting question here, for me anyway, is does Hamza actually believe what he's saying, or is he being knowingly dishonest? And before you answer, can I just say that the definition of dishonesty that I'm using is that he knowingly is trying to disseminate false information, as opposed to just saying something which is false. That's really the question. It's sort of like the psychology behind it. Is he so delusional that he believes what he's actually saying?
Yes, I think we're looking at it backwards. That to people like Sortzis, what they have is this religious certainty that their holy book is absolutely correct. So that's their starting premise: is the book is right. Therefore, the science has to be wrong. Therefore, the science has to be adjusted. Therefore, we have to fit our observations to the holy book. So. It's a whole different kind of lying, because I think he's entirely sincere in believing this, but it is invalid reasoning. That there's no a priori reason to expect that this holy book that came out of Arabia, a long, long time ago, is particularly credible as a source of scientific information. And I really think that the fundamental problem here is that to simplify it a bit and to dichotomize it a little bit more than we should, there's two ways of raising children. And one way is to raise them to question and be critical thinkers and to doubt and to study honestly and try to come up with the truth. And the other is to raise them while telling them that you already have the truth and now your purpose in life is to fulfill this truth. And that second one is the problem. It's a successful way for generating children who slot themselves into society and fit a very specific, very predetermined role. But I think it's fundamentally a kind of child abuse. What we need is some way that we can respect the fact that parents have rights to their children and vice versa, but at the same time, society also has a reasonable expectation of a fair and equitable form of education for everybody, and nobody gets to exclude themselves from it. And part of that education has to be in skepticism and critical thinking. So I think what it is, it's the difference between inquiry and rationalization. And we've got a large percentage of the population that thinks the proper way to examine the world is by rationalizing it, by fitting it to an expectation, rather than inquiry, which is an honest investigation of the truth.
Hamza and lunatics that we see on YouTube, such as Nephilim Priya and Venom Fangex, who have, all of them have come to religion late. And it seems to be that they are more fervent believers than those that actually grew up with it.
Yeah, that's been a common phenomenon I've seen, yeah. Part of it, too, though, is I think it's how they came to religion. That, a lot of people are just sort of brought up in it and they take it for granted. It's part of the background noise of their life. They don't question it, but it's there. Late converts, something traumatic happened. Something had to have happened in their life that changed it. I wrote recently about Philip Johnson, who's the guy who wrote Darwin on Trial and founded the intelligent design movement. And if you look at his biography, you discover that what happened to him is he literally went through a midlife crisis. He went through a traumatic divorce, and he was struggling for meaning in his life. And what does he do? He turns to Jesus. And I think that's a very, very common phenomenon, that people are frustrated, they're unhappy, they're grappling with something they can't handle, and suddenly religion comes along, and it doesn't give them the tools to handle the problem. It gives them the tools to evade the problem, and they can escape responsibility from it. And then they have a very powerful interest in that particular belief. Emotions are real and valid. I think that's a perfectly good reason to adopt, to initially adopt some sort of idea. And I can see where many converts to religion find it satisfying and interesting, and it helps them think the way they want to think. But that's a whole different question from, is it true? And we skeptics sit around and we're not asking, okay, does this idea make me feel better? No, we're asking, is this idea true? And if it's true, then we want to pursue it. But if it's not, it doesn't matter how good it makes you feel. That's the whole big difference here is that we have a set of tools that allow us to test and evaluate our positions. We actually try to honestly assess our own position, and we also honestly question it when parts of it are shaky or wrong. And that's why it turns out our position is so strong, is because we actually do get out there and weed out the stuff that doesn't work and add new stuff that does work and build it stronger and stronger and stronger. And they're stuck with their foundation, their absolute foundation that they will not change. You mentioned earlier that most Muslims are good people, and I agree entirely. And it's the same with most Christians. Islam and Christianity and whatever faith you want to have isn't directly the problem. The problem, though, is that when you've got large numbers of people who have adopted a way of thinking that basically unmoors them from reality, that says you do not have to do a test of your ideas against the actual facts and evidence. What you've done is created a huge reservoir of potential nonsense where these people can be easily led into very dangerous positions. I have a fairly optimistic view of humanity, and I think the only reason religion hasn't destroyed us is that most people deep down have a little bit more common sense than that. But still, it's a problem that what we have is, a species-wide sanctioned philosophy that says you don't have to trust in reality. That what you have to trust in is whatever you want to believe in. And like you say, most of these people are nice, they're good people, but that sure is a really dangerous idea to hold.
Is your position still the claim that bones come before flesh is erroneous because they don't?
Yes, it is. It definitely is. Even in Sortz's defense that he made on YouTube, he required some equivocation. What he said was that he had a biology text that said the cartilaginous framework of the bone developed, and then myotubes differentiated. If we're going to be nitpicking words, cartilage isn't bone. There's no bone there. You don't get bone until quite late in development, and that's long after muscles have appeared. At root, I think the problem is simply an attempt at oversimplification. He's only got 2 verses. They're kind of vague verses at that. And yet this process of determination and differentiation of the tissues of a limb is a complex, elaborate phenomenon that takes a long time to execute and takes almost as long to describe our knowledge about it. So you simply can't equate the two. They just don't go together. When I get together with scientists will argue just as much as we will with religious people, okay? But the thing is that the things we argue about are things that what we have is a vested interest in trying to resolve the argument. And we want to resolve the argument towards whichever answer is the most correct one. Right. And in an argument with somebody advancing the Quran or the Bible or whatever, they do not have that honest interest in how they're going to approach the problem. So, for instance, many years ago, some colleagues and I got in a debate with some other colleagues about a very esoteric point. What we all said to each other was, okay, we're going home, we're going to the lab, we're going to go test it. We'll do the experiment, and we'll report back. And whatever the answer is that we come up with, we will accept. even the ones of us who had a vested interest in the wrong answer, like me, we were so willing to accept whatever reality told us. And unfortunately, in these debates with people like Sortsis, they do not share that interest. That's what makes the debates extremely unsatisfying, is because the only way they will accept resolution is by us wholeheartedly accepting their position.